There are aviation accidents caused by storms. There are accidents caused by mechanical failure. And then there are accidents that happen in clear weather with a perfectly flyable aircraft, where the danger builds quietly inside the cockpit. UPS Flight 1354 belongs to that last category, because this crash did not begin with chaos. It began with normality, and that is what makes it so devastating. A night that should have ended routinely. It was August 14, 2013. UPS Flight 1354, an Airbus A300F, was inbound to Birmingham, Alabama, after a routine cargo run from Louisville. No passengers, only 2 pilots in the cockpit. The weather wasn't dangerous, the aircraft wasn't broken, the airport was open. This was not a high-stress flight. And that matters, because when danger doesn't look dramatic, the human mind relaxes. The most deceptive condition in aviation. The approach into Birmingham was conducted at night. Night flying isn't inherently unsafe, but it introduces a subtle enemy: visual illusion. At Birmingham, the runway environment is surrounded by dark terrain with limited visual cues, few lights, minimal depth perception, no surrounding city glow. To the human eye, the runway can appear farther away and lower than it actually is. Pilots call this a black hole approach. And black hole approaches have claimed many aircraft, not through panic, but through misjudgment. The aircraft was flying perfectly. Let's be clear about one thing early. The Airbus A300 was fully functional. Engines normal, flight controls normal, navigation systems working. Autopilot available. There was nothing forcing the pilots into an emergency. Every system required to land safely was available. What failed was how the information was used. A critical decision. Too early. During the descent, the crew made a choice that would quietly change everything. They disconnected the autopilot early. This is not illegal. This is not uncommon. But in night approaches, especially into visually deceptive environments, autopilot provides stability and precision that human perception struggles to maintain. By hand flying early, the pilots increased workload at the exact moment precision mattered most. This decision didn't doom the flight by itself, but it removed a layer of protection. The glide slope warning that wasn't heeded. As the aircraft descended, it began drifting below the correct glide path. The instruments knew it. The systems warned it. The ground proximity warning system issued alerts indicating the aircraft was too low. These warnings were not sudden. They were progressive. They gave time to correct. But here's the problem. The pilots trusted what they saw more than what the instruments were telling them. And at night, the human eye is a poor judge. Task saturation. Without panic. This is where many people misunderstand cockpit dynamics. The pilots were not panicking. They were not shouting. They were not overwhelmed emotionally. They were task saturated. That's more dangerous. Task saturation occurs when attention narrows, cross-checking decreases, warnings blend into background noise. The cockpit becomes busy, but not chaotic, and busy cockpits make quiet mistakes. The first officer spoke, but not strongly enough. One of the most painful findings in this accident involves crew resource management. The first officer noticed deviations. He voiced concern, but his call-outs were hesitant, non-assertive, not forceful enough to trigger immediate correction. In modern aviation, this matters deeply, because safety doesn't depend on authority, it depends on clarity. And clarity was missing at the worst possible moment. Descending below minimums, unknowingly. As the aircraft continued its descent, it crossed a critical line: minimum descent altitude. Below this point, pilots must either see the runway clearly or immediately go around, but visual illusion convinced the crew they were higher than they were. The instruments were right, the warnings were right, the perception was wrong, and perception won. The final seconds, no time left. When the pilots finally realized the aircraft was dangerously low, there was no margin left. No altitude to recover, no time to add thrust, no space to climb. The aircraft struck terrain short of the runway. Both pilots were killed instantly. The cargo never mattered. The aircraft never mattered. What mattered was that the accident happened without fire, weather, or system failure. Why this crash? Shook Aviation, UPS Flight 11354 terrified. Safety experts for one reason. Everything required for survival was present. Yet the flight still ended fatally. That means the system didn't fail loudly. It failed quietly. Through early automation disengagement, over-reliance on visual cues, insufficient challenge from the first officer, delayed response to warnings, not reckless mistakes, human ones. Aviation accidents almost never hinge on a single mistake. They happen when reasonable decisions stack up, quietly removing safety margins until there is nothing left to absorb error. UPS Flight 11354 is a textbook example of this process. Nothing the crew did was reckless. Nothing they did was illegal. But together, their decisions formed a chain that could not be broken in time. The invisible pressure of a routine. Flight cargo pilots operate in a unique environment. No passengers, no cabin crew, often late at night. These flights are usually predictable, and predictability breeds expectation. Expectation is dangerous because it tells the brain, this will end the way it always does. That mindset subtly reduces vigilance, especially during the most critical phase of flight, approach and landing. UPS Flight 11354 was deep inside that mental zone. Early autopilot disengagement, a critical shift. Let's return to the moment the crew disconnected the autopilot. Hand flying is not wrong. Pilots are trained for it. But autopilot provides precise glide path tracking, stable descent rates, reduced workload. By disconnecting early at night, the crew increased cognitive load, manual precision demands, reliance on visual cues. This was the first time margin was voluntarily reduced. Not lost, reduced. The black hole. Illusion takes hold. As the aircraft approached Birmingham, the runway lights were visible, but the surrounding terrain was nearly black. No city glow, no horizon reference, minimal depth perception. This created the black hole illusion, where pilots subconsciously believe they are higher than they actually are. To correct this perceived high position, pilots instinctively descend faster. This illusion is powerful because it feels correct. Your eyes tell you the truth. Your instruments tell you something else. And human brains tend to trust eyes first. Instruments versus perception. The quiet conflict. The flight instruments showed a developing problem. The aircraft was drifting below glide path. This was not sudden. It happened gradually. Gradual errors are dangerous because they don't trigger urgency. The crew did not aggressively cross-check. Vertical speed, altitude versus distance, glide slope deviation. Not because they didn't know how, but because attention was narrowing. Task saturation without alarms. The cockpit wasn't chaotic. It was busy. Manual flying, radio communication, configuration changes, approach monitoring. Each task by itself was manageable. Together, they created task saturation. In task saturation, pilots focus on the task in front of them. Peripheral cues get ignored. Warnings lose urgency. This is why modern cockpits rely heavily on automation to prevent exactly this condition. The ground, proximity. Warnings, too late, too quiet. The aircraft's warning systems activated, but these warnings were progressive, non-instantaneous, designed to alert, not command. The crew heard them, but did not fully process their meaning. Why? Because the warnings conflicted with visual perception. And when humans receive conflicting inputs, they often choose the one that feels more real. At night, that choice can be fatal. The first officer's role, a critical human factor. One of the most painful lessons from this accident involves crew resource management, CRM. The first officer noticed deviations. He made comments, but he did not escalate forcefully. He did not demand a go-around. He did not override authority. This is not about blame. It's about psychology. Hierarchical cockpits can suppress assertiveness, especially when the captain is experienced. The situation doesn't feel dramatic. Time pressure is high. Safety requires challenge. And challenge was too soft. The go-around that never came a go-around is the safest maneuver in aviation. It solves almost everything, but it requires early recognition. By the time the aircraft descended below minimums, the window for a safe go-around had already closed. The crew didn't choose to continue unsafely. They didn't realize how unsafe it had become. That distinction matters. Why there was no recovery when the pilots finally recognized the severity of the situation. Altitude was insufficient. Thrust response was delayed. Pitch up could not arrest descent. The aircraft struck terrain short of the runway. There was no dramatic last-second failure, just physics catching up to misjudgment. The most uncomfortable finding. Investigators later stated something deeply unsettling. The accident was survivable up until the final seconds, meaning a slightly higher glide path, a single assertive call-out, a brief return to instruments. Any one of these could have changed the outcome. But accidents don't allow rewinds. To understand why UPS Flight 13934 unfolded the way it did, we have to step back from the cockpit for a moment. Because pilot mistakes don't exist in a vacuum. They are shaped, sometimes quietly, sometimes powerfully, by environment, timing, and human limits that aviation still struggles to fully control. UPS Flight 1354 occurred at the exact intersection of those factors. The reality of night cargo operations. Cargo aviation operates on a schedule most people never experience. Late nights, early mornings, circadian lows. UPS Flight 1354 was arriving during the window when human alertness is naturally reduced, even in well-rested individuals. This does not mean the pilots were asleep. It does not mean they were careless. It means their brains were working against biology, and biology always collects its debt quietly. Fatigue without sleepiness. One of the most dangerous myths about fatigue is that it looks like yawning or nodding off. In reality, fatigue often looks like reduced vigilance, slower error detection, narrowed attention, increased reliance on habit. Pilots can feel fine and still be cognitively impaired. That's what makes fatigue so insidious. In UPS Flight 11354, fatigue likely didn't cause mistakes directly, but it reduced the crew's ability to catch and correct them early. Why night makes visual illusions stronger. Visual illusions don't just exist. They amplify at night, at Birmingham. Sparse ground lighting, dark terrain, limited peripheral cues. This environment removes depth perception and distorts vertical judgment. During daylight, instruments and visuals tend to agree. At night, they often conflict. And when fatigue is present, the brain defaults to what feels intuitive: vision. The false comfort of familiarity. Both pilots had landed at Birmingham before. Familiar airports can be deceptive. Familiarity tells the brain, you know this place, which reduces conscious cross-checking. Pilots don't stop caring, but they stop questioning. That's when small deviations slide through unnoticed. The role of monotony before critical tasks. The crew's portion of the flight was uneventful, smooth, predictable, routine. This creates cognitive relaxation. Then suddenly, at the approach phase, workload spikes. This rapid transition, from low stimulation to high precision, can overwhelm attention. especially when autopilot is removed early. The brain doesn't instantly reconfigure. It lags. Why? The environment didn't feel dangerous. Nothing about the approach screamed emergency. No storm, no turbulence, no system failure. This matters because humans escalate response based on perceived threat, not actual risk. UPS Flight 11354 never felt like a crisis, and that false sense of safety delayed decisive action. The silent erosion of cross-checking. As workload increased, cross-checking decreased. This isn't negligence. It's a known human limitation. When attention narrows, one pilot flies. The other monitors, but less effectively. Instrument scans shorten. Deviations grow slowly. By the time deviations feel obvious, margins are gone. Why night accidents feel unfair? One of the reasons this accident disturbed investigators is that the same crew, in daylight, would almost certainly have landed safely. The aircraft, the procedures, the skills. Nothing else needed to change. Just the light. That's a hard truth to accept, but an important one. The psychological trap of almost there. Approach phase creates a powerful mental bias. We're almost done. This bias encourages continuation. It discourages go-arounds, even when logic says, reset, try again. At night, with fatigue and no obvious danger, that bias grows stronger. What investigators learned from this did not conclude that fatigue alone caused the crash. They concluded that fatigue increased vulnerability, night amplified illusion, workload masked deviation, familiarity reduced skepticism. Together, these created a perfect human trap. UPS Flight 11354 was not about bad pilots making bad decisions. It was about good pilots operating at the edge of human performance, without realizing how close that edge was. That's what makes the story uncomfortable, because it means this accident is relatable, not exceptional. By the time investigators reconstructed the final minutes of UPS Flight 11354, a troubling pattern had emerged. This accident wasn't just about two pilots in a cockpit. It was about a system that relied on humans to be perfect in conditions that make perfection unlikely. And that's where segment 4 begins. Training that assumed ideal conditions. The pilots of UPS Flight 11354 were trained, qualified, and current. They had practiced approaches, go-arounds, instrument procedures, automation management. But training often happens in controlled environments. Daylight scenarios, clear visual cues, defined failures, obvious threats. What training rarely reproduces accurately is subtle danger. The kind that feels normal, looks manageable, doesn't trigger urgency. UPS Flight 11354 didn't fail training standards. It revealed their blind spots. Black hole approaches. Known but underestimated black hole. Approaches were not unknown in aviation. They were documented. They were taught. But teaching awareness is not the same as building instinctive resistance. Pilots knew the illusion existed. What they weren't conditioned to do consistently was to override visual instinct with instruments, even when visuals felt convincing. Training acknowledged the illusion. It did not neutralize it. Automation. Philosophy. Optional or essential. At the time of the accident, hand flying was often encouraged as a skill-building exercise. And that philosophy isn't wrong. But UPS Flight 11354 exposed a contradiction. Automation is often treated as a convenience, when, in reality, during night approaches, it is a safety barrier. The system allowed, without friction, for early autopilot disengagement, increased manual workload, reduced glide path stability. No alert said, "This is a high-risk moment to hand fly." The decision was legal. But legality does not equal safety. Crew resource management when hierarchy still matters. Modern aviation promotes flat cockpits, but human psychology doesn't flatten easily. In UPS Flight 1354, the captain was experienced. The first officer was less senior. The situation did not feel critical. This combination suppresses assertiveness. The first officer noticed problems. He spoke, but not forcefully. And here lies one of the hardest truths in aviation. Safety doesn't just require speaking up. It requires being heard. Training emphasized communication. It did not ensure interruption authority in subtle danger scenarios. The go-around paradox. A go-around is safe. A go-around is trained. A go-around is encouraged. And yet, statistically, pilots hesitate to initiate them. Why? Because go-arounds feel like failure. Because continuation bias is powerful. Because almost there clouds judgment. The system did not counteract this bias strongly enough. There was no procedural tripwire saying, below this point, deviations require mandatory go-around. Responsibility stayed human, and humans hesitate. Warning systems that informed but did not command the aircraft's warning systems worked. They did exactly what they were designed to do. Provide alerts, indicate deviation, warn of proximity. What they did not do was override. They informed. They did not force. This design assumes that pilots will interpret urgency correctly. Pilots will act decisively. Pilots will not be cognitively overloaded. UPS Flight 1354 showed the limits of that assumption. The system expected too much, quietly. This is the uncomfortable realization investigators reached. The system expected two humans, at night, at circadian low, in a visually deceptive environment to detect subtle deviations, override visual instinct, escalate communication, make an early go-around decision, all without strong external triggers. That's not impossible, but it's fragile, and fragile systems fail without warning. Why this was a systemic failure? Investigators avoided blaming individuals for a reason. Because blaming pilots doesn't fix visual illusion, fatigue, cognitive bias, human hierarchy. Only systems can address those. UPS Flight 1354 wasn't caused by one bad choice. It was caused by too many unchallenged normal ones. What aviation had to confront this accident forced aviation to ask, should automation be used differently at night? Should go-arounds be easier to justify procedurally? Should warnings be more directive in approach phases? Should training focus more on subtle traps than dramatic failures? These questions don't have simple answers, but ignoring them guarantees repetition. When the wreckage of UPS Flight 1354 was cleared from the trees short of the runway, the aviation world was left with an unsettling realization. Nothing catastrophic had failed. Nothing unpredictable had occurred. And yet, two pilots were dead. This final segment is not about the impact. It's about the echo, the lessons that followed, the gaps that remain, and why this accident continues to unsettle professionals years later. The investigation's final verdict. Investigators concluded that the probable cause of the crash was the flight crew's continuation of an unstabilized approach and their failure to maintain the proper glide path, resulting in controlled flight into terrain. But that sentence, while technically correct, hides something important. It describes what happened, not why it was allowed to happen. The investigation made it clear. This was not a story of recklessness. It was a story of human vulnerability left unguarded. What actually changed after UPS Flight 1354? The industry did not ignore this crash. Changes followed, quietly, incrementally. 1. Stabilized approach. Discipline. Strengthened airlines reinforced stabilized approach criteria, especially mandatory go-arounds when parameters are not met, reduced tolerance for salvaging approaches, clearer call-outs tied to altitude gates. The message became sharper. Unstable means go around, no debate. 2. Greater emphasis on instrument trust. At night training programs increased focus on instrument-first flying during night approaches, recognizing and overriding visual illusions. Treating black hole environments as high risk by default, pilots were reminded of a hard truth. Your eyes are not always your allies. 3. CRM assertiveness. Reframed crew resource management training shifted tone. It wasn't just about speaking up anymore. It became about interrupting. First officers were encouraged and explicitly authorized to escalate concerns decisively, command a go-around if needed, treat silence as a risk factor, because politeness has no place in the final 1,000 feet. What did not change and still bothers experts. Despite improvements, some vulnerabilities remain. Human bias still exists. Continuation. Bias didn't disappear. Fatigue didn't vanish. Visual illusion didn't weaken. They are part of being human. Which means safety still depends on layers, not heroics. Automation philosophy is still debated. The industry still struggles with balance. When to hand fly, when to automate. When automation should protect, not just assist. UPS Flight 1354 sits at the center of that debate and still has no universal answer. Why this crash is still taught. UPS Flight 1354 is taught, not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. No storm, no explosion, no warning signs outsiders would recognize. Just a quiet erosion of margin. In training rooms, instructors say, "This could happen to any of us." And that's not fear-mongering, that's honesty. The most uncomfortable lesson of all. Perhaps the hardest truth to accept is this: if you change one thing, one call-out, one glance at the instruments, one go-around decision, this accident never happens. But aviation doesn't allow us to change one thing retroactively. It forces us to design systems that don't depend on perfection. UPS Flight 1354 showed us what happens when systems assume humans will always catch subtle danger in time. What this story really warns us about this crash isn't a warning about bad pilots. It's a warning about normal pilots on normal nights making normal decisions, until those decisions quietly stop being safe. That's why this story matters. Because it doesn't feel distant. It feels close. The final truth. UPS Flight 1354 was doomed not by a single mistake, but by a system that let small, understandable human errors line up without interruption. The shocking truth is not that pilots made mistakes. The shocking truth is how easy it was for those mistakes to pass unnoticed, until there was no sky left to recover in. UPS Flight 1354 didn't just end a flight. It became a case study in human limitation, quiet risk, and the danger of assuming normal means safe. And that lesson, uncomfortable as it is, may be the most valuable one aviation has to offer.